Hey guys, it's SharpZ, and well, October and the middle of November, because my upload schedule got all messed up, are finally through. So it looks like we can just kind of drop the horror stuff for a while. Oh man, it makes me happy. Finally, we can talk about some light and not disturbing topics. So what do we have on our plates today? That's a dead body. Darn it. Well, December will focus on deduction, logic, and kind of that center of and style of gaming. Why that from something more generalistic and fairly broad like horror games? Because it's my channel and I do what I want. Also because it's kind of a section of gaming that I absolutely have a love for. And Obra Dinn, I feel, is one of the perfect examples of it. And, well, what is Obra Dinn? Let me just give you the short pitch before we get into the spoiler-free review section. Return of Obra Dinn follows an insurance claimant as he assesses the property damage and settlements on a ship known as the Obra Dinn. Throughout this game, you're going to be trying to assess the identities and cause of death for multiple crew members. If I remember correctly, the amount is 30. And while the game is relatively simple gameplay-wise, you're mostly just going through lists and trying to figure out how everything fits together within one long book through drop-down menus. This simplicity hides a lot of complexity within it. Alright, so for this, I'm just going to be using footage from the first section of the game, which I want to say that comprises about 3 or 4 flashbacks, but it's not really going to spoil anything. You're going to briefly see me do the first 1 or 2 deductions, but those ones are pretty much gimmies. So beyond that, I'm not going to spoil anything in this section. I'm sorry, I love that. Fine, I'll get to the actual darn game. Obra Dinn's gameplay is fairly simple. Usually you're chronicling your findings within a book. This is done via menus, which in my experience were fairly easy to navigate. In addition, the little dioramas are easy to walk through, and the controls to move and navigate around the ship are fairly responsive. Only a few issues. Certain segments on repeat playthroughs feel very slow due to timer preventing you from immediately leaving or logging data surrounding the murder in the area. You can't actually list a cause of death until you see the diorama in which the person dies or goes missing. And, well, navigation in the actual ship itself is also kind of clunky, with the map and flashbacks often feeling unintuitive to navigate between. For gameplay, I'm not going to go too high here. It's not revolutionary, but it definitely works for what they're trying to do, despite the kind of clunkiness that the execution sometimes has. Since this is a mystery game, I'm going to keep this section very brief. The story and underlying mystery is fairly, I would say, unique in how they present it. It's nothing too crazy or out of left field for what you would expect, but it is so well put together that I can't really find a flaw in it. The graphical style of this game, needless to say, since, well, you've been seeing it on screen, is really unique. The art style is generally referred to as 1-bit, and with Obra Dinn in particular, it's based off the styling of old computer games, which you can see if you go into the menus. They actually have options to switch between different monitors. I believe there's an old Macintosh, an IBM, a few others like that. But it certainly gives it kind of this timeless feel, and in a weird way, the one thing I think I remember comparing it to during the stream was the little art vignettes that you'll see at the top of chapters in, like, the kind of older books you see. Like, I want to say, like, Narnia had it, or, there's quite a few that did it. But anyway, Another benefit of this art style is it's easy to disconnect from some of the absolutely gruesome stuff going on when you can't really see blood or any other form of gore realistically. And, well, while this aesthetic is visually pleasing, with plenty of accessibility options, it also works well with the overall concept, obscuring specifics of the mystery, and driving players to use other means. The art style only has one thing I would consider to be a major downside, at least on my end. It messes with depth perception, at least for me sometimes. And I did fiddle with the settings a little bit, and I, at least on console, could not find anything to make it work. Maybe using an outside program on PC, if you had the same issues I did, you could make it work. But I did find eventually that some filters do work a little better for that than others. But, yeah, I feel like it is a very good look for the game. So I'm just going to go ahead and say that it still deserves a high rating, but I'm going to dock just a slight bit of points for the depth perception issues I had. I looked online, and I think I saw maybe one or two other people mentioning it, but I don't think it's enough to dock it any more than 1 point. Obra Dinn's soundtrack is mostly, I would say, a dynamic, responsive kind of thing. For example, when you turn on the pocket watch, you hear a little tune go off before you enter the flashbacks. But the music is pretty good. You've been hearing it in the background throughout this section. But overall, I do have one criticism of that music. It does kind of blend together. It all fits with the whole maritime setting of it, but it just kind of has a side effect of no song really stands out. The one I'm playing in the background right now is the backing theme for Chapter 2, and that one is probably my favorite one out of the ones that we do have, but it's just kind of very hard if you were to ask me which one do I think is absolutely the best song. None of them really stood out to me too much. Outside of music, environmental sound is spot on, whether it be the creaking floorboards, the storms, the sea. Everything sounds accurate and fitting for an old ship like the Obra Dinn. Voice acting is another high point. Accents and languages are often a means of deduction, so it stands to reason that the voices are clear, and usually they do provide subtitles, so that's a nice accessibility option. The acting is also fairly convincing, at least from my perspective, and at least within the languages I know, the audio seems fitting. Also, audio mixing is really, really good. There were very few, if any, times that I remember having my immersion broken because I was thinking, oh, that sound could not have come from that specific angle, or this doesn't sound like it's taking place in an old wooden ship. So I feel like that's kind of a good sign that they really, really nailed the audio here. Alright, and for those of you who have seen my Silent Hill 2 review, you know that now we're in that final little section, the point that I like to call cohesion. This is where I cover pretty much everything else, and how it works together. So I would say everything here is fairly cohesive. Let's start with the positives, just because there's a whole lot, and I feel like the negatives I could go through fairly quickly. So the art style, menus, narrative, all fit that old style. And deduction, investigation segment of gameplay, I would say all that is fairly well done. It's just kind of the navigation, ironically enough, since you're on a ship, that I would say is the hardest part of this game. I would say, for example, with when investigation in this game is so focused to some extent on things like timelines, when characters are last seen, where characters appear and don't appear, and context clues. A list appearing under a character once you highlight them in a cutscene. For example, if I were to say, see the captain on a certain position in the ship within a specific cutscene, and I were to zoom in on him, and then they show, oh, that's his photo, I feel like I should get a small listing at the bottom of that character sheet saying appeared here, here, and here, because at least to what I saw, it only lists the first and the last one, and that's from what I've seen in my last few playthroughs of the game. And the other issue compounding this game is when you first play through it, you have to go from corpse to corpse to enter when you first enter a flashback. So sometimes that means you'll find a corpse on the top of the ship, and then you need to go all the way to the bottom to find the next one, and you're just going from place to place, and it kind of gets frustrating. After unlocking all the flashbacks, it's kind of an issue when you have a few corpses that are stuck between flashbacks. So you I at least found with myself there were a few times where I was kind of frustrated because I forgot which corpse went to where, or where a corpse fit in the timeline. So it kind of became more so frustrating than a memorable aspect of gameplay at kind of near the tail end. I would say after you first get all the flashbacks, and if you are doing your deduction along the way, which I would recommend, then it's not going to feel as long, because once you have all the flashbacks together, if you were doing your deductions along the way, you'll probably only have 3 or 4 characters who you don't know where they are, where they come from. I'd say overall it's about a 3 out of 5 for cohesion. I'm just not going to do any visual things here. While most of it's fairly cohesive, few aspects of gameplay seem to directly work against the player during their investigation. So, overall, it gets around an 80. Unlike previous reviews as well, there was a section in the Silent Hill 2 review where I covered the ports. There's not really, to my knowledge, any difference in the ports aside from, I think, the PC version you can control with keyboard and mouse, but I don't think there's anything too major. Now, with all the spoiler-free stuff out of the way, let's get into the spoiler review segment. And if you want to play this game, please go grab it. It's $19.99 on Steam, and I think it's on pretty much every console. I know it's on Switch. Want to say it's on PS4 and Xbox as well. Do not know if it's on Game Pass or PlayStation Pass. I didn't think to check before this review. Mostly because it's the kind of game where I'm like, look, if you find it on Game Pass, pick it up. I can easily recommend it. If you need a good game that will take you around, maybe my first playthrough about a year ago, it took me around 8 hours to get all of the deductions done. Playthrough recently took me around 5, and that was I played this game 3 times. Let me put it this way: played this game 3 times, each about a year apart. So yeah, I've had a fairly decent amount of experience with it. So I whittled my time down to about 5 hours, but it'll likely take you around, I would say 6 to 7. But yeah, $19.99 on Steam, and I want to say it's around that price on consoles as well. Maybe $29.99 on Switch. Usually the Switch game goes up in price for some reason, and I want to say there is a physical release, but it was limited run. So if you really want to get that physical release, you might have to look around to find it. But yeah, let's get into the actual darn review. You know what? I'm gonna get some tea or something on my system, just so I have this. Alright, well, that idiot's gone. Let me go ahead and set the stage for you. So, the Obra Dinn takes place 5 years after the ship was abandoned by all 30 crew members. You are an insurance claimant working with the East India Company, hired to, well, discover what happened on the ship so they can file a claim on it. And, well, let's just say you've been given a specific tool to do so. Memento Mori, a pocket watch which will teleport you to the time of death of any corpse. Yeah. So let's get started. Sorry, I was just starting the kettle over in my kitchen. so I can make some tea here in a minute. Chief Inspector, Insurance Claims, London office. Since the order you discover the bodies is fairly non-linear, and really there's not too much plot on our end, I'm just going to go ahead and kind of summarize the first few deductions you make before giving a general overview of what
Forget how much
is
aesthetic
entailed in the process of deduction. So we find our first body right by the, this idiot will actually use the darn watch. Thank you. We find our first body right outside the captain's quarters, and due to the context of the dialogue, the sound, and, well, as you'll see now, it's pretty obvious how this guy died. We can tell that this person died via a gunshot. And, well, while we don't know who this person is, and really we don't know who most of the people within the context of this one vignette are, there are a few things that we can tell. Number one, whoever got shot here has some relation to the person inside because they're having a conversation and they seem to know who each other are. But more importantly, it kind of gives a sign of how the investigations in this game are going to work. Usually you can find one aspect of what you need to find about a character fairly easy. For example, usually you can find their name or how they died out fairly easy if it's told in dialogue, or sometimes figuring out how they died is, well, as simple as this is the vignette where they die, and that's obviously a gunshot. But you have to match them to the crew photo that is provided within the book. And this is where things get kind of interesting, because sometimes matching a name to a crew photo is a little bit harder than simply, well, matching it to a crew photo. You see, you have to use everything from where they are in the photo to other things, so I kind of went ahead and I divided deductions into a few specific categories. And for the case of the first three, since how this game works is you have to deduce the names and causes of death and everything for a specific character in groups of three. With that entire aspect being known, it makes it so that it's nearly impossible to guess. You have to actually think through who is this person and what exactly are their connections to other people. So, for example, with the section in the captain's quarters, there are three people who you can ascertain the identity of. And that is, number one, the captain, because, well, he is the person standing in the captain's quarters, and it is a mutiny, so, yeah, that's the captain. That's fairly easy to tell. But you also have his, a woman whose body you later find, who you find out is his wife, who was killed by a falling mast, and she mentions that she is his wife. As such, you look through the passenger list, and you see one woman with a with the same last name as the captain, and he also mentions that he shot her brother. So if you look through the entire roster using her maiden name as a clue, then you can find out that her brother is, if I remember correctly, William Hoskett. So, that kind of is emblematic of how most of the deductions within this game will work. When it comes to the categories that I went ahead and made, there are attributes. Certain characters have specific clothing or tattoos which can be used to kind of guess their role. For example, a wedding band implies marriage for one character. There's a character who has a lady tattoo on them somewhere. There's roster numbers listed on hammocks. And certain clothing usually befits certain roles. like mates, midshipmen, they usually dress fairly similarly. And language and accents also follow this metric with Russian, Chinese, German, other languages that are used within the process of the game are usually a shorthand to say, hey, if there is a character speaking Chinese in this scene, Mandarin in this scene, they are probably from China or Formosa, which is it would be the period name at this time, but if I remember correctly, I want to say it is modern day Taiwan. There's also actions. So if a character holds a certain role, certain actions befit that role. For example, surgeons, smiths, cooks, butchers, they usually either reference their jobs in dialogue, or sometimes you might see someone taking part in an action that is fitting of their particular role. Like the gunners, you might see distributing munitions, or the boatswain, which is the person who is in charge of general upkeep with the boat, like rigging and things like that, or the helmsman, who will be at the wheel at all times. You can kind of tell based on their actions. Also, in this vein, the words of the deceased are actually marked in X, which is another good clue for that, because if they're talking a specific way, it will usually give you clues to that. Going off of that is relation. Do characters share attributes or some kind of a relation, either friendship or genetically or by marriage to someone else in the crew? Because that is used a few times, whether it be, they have a similar last name, or they know each other, so maybe they're near each other in the photo, or even there are a few characters who what they have nearby with them is kind of a clue to what they are doing in the photo and kind of adds some context to it. Positioning is kind of the next one. This is where is the character within the ship. So if they're in a specific office, maybe that's their place of work. If they are on the topmast, they're probably topmen. If they're sleeping in a numbered hammock, that's probably their hammock. And most characters appear with associated or similar characters close to them within the photos. For example, the two playing poker below deck are, based on the conversation, likely the two people who are playing poker similarly within the photo up top. With all of these aside, after the clues are all put together and the damage is accounted for, here's what we kind of come up with as a general plot line. And at this point, I've been kind of vague with it, but I'm just going to say it. I insist you either play the game completely on your own or watch a playthrough of some kind. Mine is actually playing in the background right now. But for those who want to skip this section, I have the video chapters listed below this video, and you should be able to just skip directly past this into more so the generalized review section. In 1802, the Obra Dinn launches from London with a completely full crew roster and the Formosan royal family. With the family are 2 guards, 2 members of the royals are present, and a chest containing a few magical shells. All of these details are important for the rest of the story, so let us continue. The first death aboard the Obra Dinn happens long before the rest of them. During the process of loading cargo onto the ship, one of the crew members is crushed, and a stowaway that was hiding in one of the barrels dies as well. Two of the seamen catch a mysterious illness and pass away. Meanwhile, a cow on the ship is slaughtered for its meat. These first two chapters do not really have a lot of overall plot relevance. However, we're about to get into Chapter 3, where the majority of the plot of Obra Dinn actually begins. 1 and 2 are more so set up for later events, or, in the case of 2, a semi-tutorial on other ways to find characters.
Hello? Who is there? Who is that? Is someone hurt? Signore Nichols, is that you? What are you doing down here?
Oh, hello, yes. All fine here. Just, sorting some things.
Watch your step. Here, let me help you.
This is where the main story begins. Second mate Edward Nichols knocks out one of the Formosan guards and finds one of the ancient relics. Upon this discovery, Nichols is found by one of the passengers, who he stabs to death. He frames the guard he knocked out for murdering the passenger, leading to this guard being executed. Nichols then decides to steal the chest and escape to the Canary Isles alongside a few crewmates, and takes the royals with him as leverage and translators. They are caught while bailing onto the boats, leading Nichols to murdering one of the crew members before he sets off. Nichols and the rest of his little band set out to sea. However, the royalty begin to speak of monsters coming from the ocean. These monsters, which I will henceforth refer to as mermaids, since essentially that's what they are, and a few times throughout the game these specific ones are referred to as such, begin to kill a few of the men on the boats, and even one of the royals by clawing them to death. The other royal, however, manages to free himself, stab one of the men on the boat, and put the shell into the chest, driving the mermaids to essentially go unconscious. However, once he puts it into the chest, his arm is burned off by a resulting fire, and only Edward Nichols survives to row back to the Obra Dinn. Unfortunately, on his way back, he is shot by the remaining Formosan guard. I say unfortunately, but I mean, you can't deny he kind of deserves it. After grabbing the guard who shot Nichols, the crew grabs one of the top men to translate for him, and both of them are spiked by one of the mermaids. After this, well, things don't begin to look up anytime soon, let's just say that. The chef is tailed to death by one of the mermaids, and a crew member dies when the rigging they're using to carry the mermaid falls on him. Finally, one of the members of the crew goes insane upon the decision to lock the mermaids in the lazarette and kills another crewmate with a sword. He himself is then thrown into the lazarette along with the mermaids. An unspecified amount of time later, a few crab people enter the ship and begin to head toward the lazarette. Before they enter, one of the top men is killed by a lightning strike, one of the other top men is speared by one of the beasts, and, well, the carpenter's mate is spiked. The surgeon's mate is decapitated alongside one of the other top men, and one of the midshipmen is burned accidentally in an explosion. The Butcher is spiked as well, as is one of the ship's stewards, who is actually accidentally shot in the entire process by the boatswain's mate. However, there is one man who seems to have made the best of the situation, Winston Smith the carpenter, who manages to kill the final beast all the way down at the bottom row, even while in the process he was killed himself. A few men decide to abandon ship. However, due to squabbles between two of the men, one clubs another one to death. Meanwhile, the ship's artist is strangled to death by a kraken on the tail end of the ship. The kraken then proceeds to kill a majority of the members on the gunner's deck, including the gunner as well as the third mate's steward, by crushing them with cannons and even firing one onto the deck itself. Meanwhile, on the top deck, a few of the top men fall to their deaths, a midshipman dies in an explosion, and many are torn to death by the beasts. During the chaos, the wife of the captain is killed by a mast broken by the kraken. The escaping shipmen are killed by the kraken as well when he overturns their boat, and the helmsman as well as the boatswain's mate are both killed by the kraken during this time. This part is not actually revealed to the player until the very end of the game, so I'm going to skip over this chapter. Just know that 2 crew members go missing here. The boatswain dies from wounds received by the kraken. Meanwhile, 2 passengers, alongside the surgeon, the first mate steward, and the fourth mate steward all decide to escape. The first mate steward is killed by one of the crewmates while he is on his way to the boat. In retaliation, one of the passengers who is escaping kills the crewmate. The captain decides to let this group escape, however, the gunner's mate starts a mutiny and stabs the final midshipman. After this, he is immediately shot by the fourth mate. Henry Brennan then kills said fourth mate with the club. The first mate, William Hoskett, holds the dying midshipman in his arms. At this point, there are only 4 men left on the ship: Captain Robert Whittrell, First Mate William Hoskett, Seaman Henry Brennan, and top man Lewis Walker. The remaining 4 crew members decide to rush the captain's quarters, but it doesn't go well. Hoskett is shot almost immediately by the captain. Brennan is killed shortly after due to a slit throat, and the final member, Topman Lewis, is clubbed with the back of a spear. All that remains now is the captain, and well...
Abigail, your brother, my friend, I shot him dead. I'll be with you soon, my love. Please forgive me for everything.
The story itself is nothing special. It's fairly standard for a mystery novel, however, it's the presentation and pacing that makes it exemplary. The way information is given to the player is piece by piece and often out of order. As such, commonly the player will ask questions or form conclusions that are later changed or explained by new information. For example, the final chapters, which I usually find in my playthroughs, are chapters 3 and 4. The chapters which in the context of the wider story, provide the most information. Furthermore, sometimes the flashback at the time of death is not as important to solving the overall mystery of a murder as an earlier flashback. For example, with one victim in the escape chapter, the flashback which revealed who killed him is not the final one, but the second flashback where you can actually see the attacker. I would say what makes Obra Dinn a definitive game within the logic and deduction genre is the lack of limitation on the player. If you look at other games, they're fairly linear. But with Obra Dinn, even though the story, by nature of it being a story, is fairly linear, the lines of logic and deduction are not. They interweave, split, and often have a ripple effect throughout the information that you do know. The game relies on the player to recognize what is important and vital information. There's no case file. There's really nothing that is telling you, hey, you see this specific item of clothing? Or do you see this or this or this? It's up to the player to say, that might be important, I'll save that evidence for later. We don't get a case file, we just get a book to record what we think happened. A watch to remember the dead. And our only companion during this is the sea itself. The chapter I did not summarize, the bargain, is presented to the player after they have deduced all the endings of the people on the ship that they can. At this point, you don't know the fate of two specific people, and that will be the third mate and the captain's steward. The book, which we later find was a gift from the ship's surgeon, is sent back to us with a literal monkey's paw. And with how the watch works, we can go to the time of the death of this animal, and this reveals the information that kind of brings the game together. Our final chapter begins with the captain's steward who was locked in the lazarette after going insane. Shortly after he's put into there, he opens the chest that was left in there with him containing the shells, but is quickly burned to death, exclaiming that it kind of reminds him of Quicksilver. Later, during the Kraken attack, the captain enters and throws away all but one of the shells. During the process of trying to stop the Kraken, the captain kills two of the mermaids, one with a spear and one with a gun. There is now only one mermaid remaining within the cell. Even later, Martin Perot, the third mate, enters alongside the fourth mate steward and the first mate steward. Unfortunately, he is spiked by the mermaid before he can accomplish what he wants to do. However, the two stewards grab the mermaid and are able to see it off, holding the final shell. As the mermaid is exiting the room, Perot tells her to see the Obra Dinn safely home. Even later, Dr. Henry Evans, the ship's surgeon, throws his pet monkey into the room, tying it to a rope and shooting it. Why did he do this? Well, you see, he suspected that a specific pocket watch, one which we have in our possession in the game, would be used later. And through the paw of his dead monkey, we can finally figure out what happened within that lazarette. Finally know the mysteries of what happened on the Obra Dinn. With all that being said, how does the final chapter draw this game to a close? In my opinion, fairly well. When it comes to endings, learning the fate of Martin Perot, a fairly notable crew member throughout the overall plot, learning why the surgeon left, and at least for me, kind of led to the conclusion of something fairly tragic. The captain is implied to be down in the hold killing the mermaids during the Kraken attack. There's a line that's said by Martin that specifically points this out. When his wife asks where he is, he says he's down below the decks. What we now know is that during this time, he was killing the mermaids. And around this time was when his wife was killed. The actions of the captain potentially killed not just his crew, but might have indirectly killed his wife as well. The Obra Dinn is unique when it comes to mystery games. There are very few that I can recollect off the top of my head where they put as much of an effort into making you feel like a detective. The thing is, rather than working with the information you have, you're working with the information you're given. The key reason I'm saying this is it's up to you to organize the information, decide what will lead to those conclusions you need to make. That, in a weird way, cuts out a lot of work for the developer. But it puts more of a burden in that you need to make sure that the player can deduce these things. And well, at least from my experience, you can do a lot worse than the Obra Dinn. Now, to answer one final question I know some people are thinking, why'd you pick this one? Well, I feel like it kind of sets a perfect tone for what I want the next month to cover. Logic and deduction. And while I know I've praised Obra Dinn a lot in this video, it is by no means the one that I consider the end-all be-all for anything logic and deduction based. It's a game that has its flaws, but what it tries to do, it does very, very well, and I honestly can't fault it for that. And, at least on my end, it appeals to what I like. It makes me feel like the game trusts me enough to make those decisions. It's what I like to call a notepad game. The kind of game where they expect you to take notes, or you really benefit from doing it, but they're not going to tell you that, because if you think you need to take notes, you'll figure it out. Now, what other games are we going to cover this month? You know what? Since we covered one, why don't we jump to all of them? That's right, coming out soon, we have the next episode of Genre in a Bottle where we are covering logic and deduction games. Which is a step down from horror games, because we don't have to cover, like, 70. Maybe I should have started with this one. Anyway, that's a problem for later me. Modern me is just happy to be back. Until next time, guys, SharpZ, signing off.